Okay, so today I'm going to be reading a book. It's called Pick a Pumpkin, Mrs. Millie. And it's going to be by Judy Cox. Mrs. Millie, our teacher is really silly. Good morning, class, she says. It's nice to see you. It's nice to see you too, Mrs. Millie, we say. Today we are going to the pumpkin pets, Mrs. Millie tells us. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the pumpkin patch. We'll pick our pumpkins for our harvest party and bring them back and bring them back to school. No, we shall. You mean back to school. We line up to get on the bus. It's cold today, Mrs. Millie says. Don't forget your jackets. Jackals. Don't you mean our jackets, we ask, giggling. At the farm, Farmer Don gets us at the gate. We'll go on a hayride, says Mrs. Millie. Everybody on the dragon. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the wagon. The hayride takes us down the road. Look, calls Mrs. Millie, a hay crow. We know what you mean. A scarecrow, we tell her. We climb off the wagon and run into the field. Be sure to pick a big one, calls Mrs. Millie. Mrs. Millie, you mean a big one. We wade through the muddy field. Look for round orange pumas, calls Mrs. Millie. Pumpkins, we shout. After everyone has found a pumpkin, we load them onto the wagon. Now we will visit the barn, says Mrs. Millie. You can be the animals. Don't be silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean see the animals. We feed the horses. We toss grain to the chickens. Mrs. Millie takes a picture of the pigs. Time to pet the boats, she says, smiling. Silly, Mrs. Millie. You mean the goats. Mrs. Millie pets a billy. Let's help Farmer Don snake the leaves, says Mrs. Millie. You're so silly, we cry. You mean rake the leaves. We jump into the leaf pile. I spy a corn maze, says Mrs. Millie. Who wants to play hide and seek? Hide and seek, Mrs. Millie, we yell. Ready for some hot apple cider, asks Mrs. Millie. You mean apple cider, we say. How can you be so silly? Finally, it's time to leave. We'll take our pumpkins back to meal, says Mrs. Millie. We know what you mean. Back to school, we shout. We can carve them into gecko lanterns. Silly, Mrs. Millie, you mean jack-o'-lanterns, we tell her. Wasn't the pumpkin patch fun, says Mrs. Millie says, as we line up for the bus. Yes, Mrs. Millie, we had fun, we shout. Farmer Don loads our pumpkins onto the bus. Thank you, we tell them. As the bus pulls away, we wave goodbye to Farmer Don and his billy boats.